Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video is my overall thoughts and impressions after seeing Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Yes, I know it's a bit of a mouthful of a title, and I will keep this review spoiler free as I try to do in my initial reviews of new features that I see. And I also saw this in a Dolby Cinema, so I'll give my overall impressions about seeing it in a Dolby Hall versus a standard hall as well. So this, of course, is the seventh in the series and was done, well, it was originally meant to be shot back-to-back with part two, and that plan sort of went ahead, but then also sort of got canceled due to COVID and other concerns, which also affected this film and delayed its release. It was supposed to have come out last year at various intervals. Now it's been pushed to this year, and then we'll see part two of this story supposedly around the same time in June or July of next year. So essentially that staggered release is sort of like their original plan of producing both films back to back anyway, just with, an extra year because of the COVID pandemic. That, of course, means that you're left with a cliffhanger to resolve, but it's not really a cliffhanger. It's just leading to part two. There's no real sense of dramatic stakes of being like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? It's just more of this one ends, and it sets you up for the next film that will supposedly finish up this story, and then it remains unseen where the series will go from this point. Now, because this is Christopher McQuarrie returning again, it does follow a lot of the tenets that have been established and set up with the last couple of films. The series really kind of got a mini reboot with Ghost Protocol, which was the fourth film. That sort of gave the series a shot in the arm it badly needed, and reinvigorated the notion of having a team ensemble in a Tom Cruise vehicle, which the series basically had become from the first film. And in doing that and focusing more on the team members having active roles, that ironically did actually bring in at least a more direct connection to the original TV series, which the films really don't have much connection to outside of some of the names and iconography. That film, Ghost Protocol, really made the MI franchise over in the way it's seen today, and also changed how they advertised the films and focused more on the crazy one-upmanship that each film seems to try and bring, and trying to sell it on the basis of what crazy stunt will Tom Cruise do next and how much peril will he place himself in. And then came the fifth film, Rogue Nation, which was Christopher McQuarrie's entry into the series. And while I think that film did thankfully have more story elements to it, which the series has always had an issue with ever since the first film was still being the strongest in that sense, Rogue Nation was at least a nice return to having at least some more story elements and more direct spycraft flavor, even though I don't think it was quite as polished as Ghost Protocol in terms of the overall pacing and editing. It was still another in this sort of new reinvigorated Mission Impossible franchise. Then came the sixth film in Fallout, which seemed to try and bring together elements of both Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation, along with some influences, it seemed, of Christopher Nolan films, along with a flourish of the modern Daniel Craig era of Eon-produced James Bond films, where before that point, it was primarily this series was pulling at least some things and elements from the classic cinematic James Bond idea. Now we have other modern elements thrown into the mix. And Dead Reckoning Part 1, because this is Part 1 of a two-film little set and within the franchise, this is basically doubling down on everything we've seen in the past couple of films, and it very much picks up where Fallout left off in terms of the new sort of elements Fallout brought in. Those are magnified and expounded upon here. The issue anytime you have a sort of dual film or a film that does not tell you a complete story is, unfortunately, it can usually feel like a lot of setup for then something we haven't gotten yet. And unfortunately, that does happen here. The film also has for a summer action film and a spy film of this type, even though the series has become so much more about the bigger than life aspects, you still need a good, decent runtime. And unfortunately, Dead Reckoning Part 1 has an absurdly bloated runtime of, I believe the actual runtime is 2 hours and 43 minutes, which is far too long. Even if you're setting up a second film and you're having to split up a story into two films or more, 2 hours and 43 minutes is still way too long for a film of this type. And unfortunately, there's not even enough material. There's not enough content to justify the runtime, I don't think, because if you look past the big action set pieces, which go on for quite a number of minutes, they go on for a while. I mean, the story that's being told here could have been told in about 90 minutes, really. And with the action sequences pushing it to about 2 hours, maybe 220 if you wanted to push it. And that's sort of what Fallout was sitting at, which I think that was, I want to say it was 148 minutes, so, 228. So this one's just a bit longer than Fallout was, which already was a bit on the longish side. So if you're not a fan of longer runtimes, then that's definitely going to throw you. And it is part of the modern trend of trying to push even big blockbusters closer to the 3 hour mark. We also see a little bit of a change up in terms of the crew and some of the technical aspects. We have a new writer on board with Christopher McQuarrie, and this is, as far as I'm aware, this is the first film in the series to be shot entirely digitally. And we have a new cinematographer. And to be honest, it looks fine, but I don't think it looks as impressive visually as the films that came before it. Even the immediate predecessor in Fallout, I think, looked a bit more impressive in places. And this basically just feels like everything we saw in Fallout, but it just feels more bloated, and that again ties into the runtime. And there's not a whole lot of story here, so it remains to be seen what's going to turn up in part 2 of this particular story arc, and if there was really enough to justify spreading this out over 2 films. The central concept of the story is at least something that is novel and very much of our times, with the enemy essentially being an AI system that has gained sentience. That's not really a spoiler because that's in all the trailers and things. But I don't really think they do a whole lot with that, because we don't really... There's maybe one moment of actual interaction with this they refer to it as the entity, and that there's really one particular moment where there's direct interaction between this entity, sentient AI, and our IMF team members. So I guess this will all come to a head in part 2, and we'll get more of what we didn't get in this film. I'll also be curious to see if part 2 is shorter or longer than this, because in scenarios like this, it's sometimes where the first film will be the longer one because it has to do all the setup, and then the second film is actually shorter and has more of the fun bells and whistles and more of the meat of the story. They also do some interesting things because they do have a number of... the films have had some callbacks to the past films, but there's not like a whole greater sense of a continuity or world outside of the film scenarios in the Mission Impossible film series universe. But here there are some definite nods to the first film, which got me all excited because anybody who knows me, I love and adore the first film in this series, and I've never really enjoyed the sequels to the same degree. I think the series really has floundered around in a bunch of different ways, and it kind of found itself again on Ghost Protocol, but it also reformulated itself in a different way, and they've never gone back and done what I love so much about the first film is that it's a thinking man spy film inside of a summer blockbuster, so it manages to do both serious, grounded, realistic spycraft in the techno thriller days of the 90s before cell phones were everywhere, with the big summer fun action moments. But it's also a film where the lead hero of the film never fires a gun and kills anyone. So it's, again, it's a thinking man's spy film inside, hidden inside of a summer film. And it's also designed to be like a puzzle box, which in that sense makes it the only film that really, at least I think, lives up to the ideas behind the TV series, even though it's going off in its own complete direction, and fans of the TV series have never been great fans of the films because the films really have nothing to do with the TV series. But the first film, and being directed by Brian De Palma and edited by Paul Hirsch, it has a playfulness to it, and it has a little bit of a whimsy and a little bit of a rebellious streak, and it's not afraid to be challenging and deceptive, because if Mission Impossible should be anything, it should be a mind game. That's what it's supposed to be. And it's not supposed to be endless, gigantic action set pieces, which unfortunately is what the films have turned into, especially with Dead Reckoning Part 1, because when you look at the sequences, it seems like they came up with the sequences first, and then they kind of wrote the script to patch them together, which of course is, that happened on the first film too, which had a pretty notorious amount of production difficulties and endless rewrites and on the day rewrites even from multiple writers, and nobody was getting along. Nobody seemed to have a clear vision of what they were doing, but they did have set pieces and they had to sort of bridge those. However, because that film, again, is a bit of a mind game, they were able to play around with that. And of course, you have a brilliant director and a brilliant editor making the whole thing work and giving it a charge. Well, unfortunately, you don't get that here in Dead Reckoning Part 1, because if you look at the action sequences, they can drag on for, 20, 30 minutes. And then with bridging scenes in between that and the next big action sequence, if you add all of these up, if the 3 or 4 big action sequences are 30 to 40 minutes, and then the bridging dialogue scenes and small scenes are, say, 10 minutes each, well, when you add all those up, you've already got most of your nearly 2 hour and 45-minute runtime plus your credits. Another interesting thing is they once again pull from the James Bond films, which the films really from Ghost Protocol onward have started to do more and more exponentially. So much so that us Bond fans see the trailer for a new Mission Impossible movie, and we can notice how they sell it in the way a James Bond film used to be sold, particularly starting in the Roger Moore era around The Spy Who Loved Me, when Cubby Broccoli reformulated the series and started selling them as big event films, and also would try to have a big stunt in them to actually sell the film on the stunt. And here in the trailer for Dead Reckoning Part 1, you have 2 gigantic, glaring, why is no one else seeing this, lifts. One is, of course, the big motorcycle jump, which is the big selling point of the film this time around, where Tom Cruise does the jump off the mountainside. But, of course, he's got a motorcycle and he's wearing black fatigues, and, it seems pretty much cribbed from the opening of GoldenEye with the motorcycle jump after the plane, where Bond is, of course, in black fatigues when he's escaping the chemical weapons plant. And we have the beautiful shot of stuntman and motorcycle going off after the plane and then leaving the motorcycle and then going after the plane. So that seems very much obviously inspired by. And then the other is the big car chase that takes place in the middle of the film, where you have 2 characters, our super agent and our new heroine this time around of this particular film adventure, wonderfully played by Hayley Atwell, but she is obviously not a very good driver, and she's in the car with Tom Cruise's Ethan Hunt, and they tear through the city, and they're in a little crappy yellow Fiat that's getting, beat up and everything, and they pretty much took that right out of For Your Eyes Only with the yellow Citroen chase, but in the trailer, they don't show the car at least rolling over, and I'm like, well, if I go into this and they actually show the little yellow car doing barrel rolls with them inside the car and them changing seat positions and everything, then you can't possibly hide the fact that they decided to do a lift or a riff on the For Your Eyes Only chase. Well, This isn't really a spoiler, but they do that. So if you're a Bond fan, particularly of the 70s and 80s films, and you've noticed the lifts and things that have been happening in the past couple of Mission Impossibles and a lot of other modern Tom Cruise films, you're going to notice those here. They're quite obvious. There's also the sequences on the train, and they actually do seem to have been inspired, obviously, by Octopussy, because they do have a fight across the roof of the actual exterior of the train, and even the actual engine car seems to be a reference to the same engine car in Octopussy in terms of it being a similar type of design. So there are the usual Bond lifts, and this time I got so fed up with those, I actually went in with a clicker, and anytime I noticed one, I actually clicked one, or a moment that seemed pretty much derived from a Bond film. But surprisingly, for this being much longer, there were less than I thought. I only counted 16, so, this is better than usual. But it does get tiresome how they seem to just want to lift and borrow and steal from the James Bond films wherever possible. And since they're making more of a James Bond film than Eon seems to want to do, and this is about all we can get in 2023. So we have to take what little bit is there, unfortunately. Another interesting thing is they did the "world is not enough" type thing with the credits placement. The Mission Impossible films always have at least some sort of title sequence, usually not a terribly long one, just a little short thing. But it's a while before we even get to that. We just go smack into the setup for the story, and I don't know the exact runtime, but we go a long while before we actually get to the credits, to the point of you actually kind of forget that we haven't gotten the credits sequence yet. So I'd say it's probably a good, at least 15 minutes maybe before we get to the actual credits, which was, that's I'm not a fan of when they do that. I'd rather just get them out of the way up front. We do open with a sort of, well, I mean, I guess the whole opening is a pre-title sequence technically, and we see multiple events, but we are introduced to what we later find out is the location of the sentient AI, and we see this situation on a submarine that takes place. This is probably the biggest Bond connection, though, because when you actually think about the plot of this film and what the setup is, and the fact that it happens underwater and it's an actual secret ship that goes down, and there's a particular item, shall we say, on said ship that's in a remote area underwater and has to be discovered. It's For Your Eyes Only. It's the attack on the St. George's, right down to the dead crewmen in the water and such. But interestingly, this film doesn't even get to that. That's the overall MacGuffin, and that's what we're reminded of at the end of this film. But all of part one revolves around getting the parts to the key to open essentially said chamber on board this submarine that we see in the start of the film. So all of that will come into play in part two, I suppose. But the focus again is all on this little key that comes in two parts. So you would be forgiven if you actually forgot about the submarine and the actual MacGuffin until the very end, which is also a symptom of, I think, spreading this out over two different films. But I was continually reminded, and then again when the car chase came up, which was clearly inspired by the chase in For Your Eyes Only, that seems to be the film they decided to pull the most from this time. And it only made me think of how wonderfully structured For Your Eyes Only is and how effective it is. And what in the world would it be like if John Glenn got his hands on this material? Because if anybody understands how to direct a perfectly executed, taut spy thriller, an action and adventure film that, can clock in at 2 hours and 10 minutes and tell you absolutely everything you need to know and have perfectly clear executed action without any CGI usage, That's John Glenn. So that admittedly did flash through my head seeing this. We have the same cast of characters from the previous couple of films return in terms of our core IMF team. Again, Haley Atwell is the new sort of side character that's introduced for this film in particular. And unfortunately, the rest of the team members, in terms of our usual suspects returning, they don't really get to do a whole lot in this film. The opening action sequence that takes place in the Abu Dhabi airport is their most active sequence in this film, and then they're somewhat there in a few of the later action sequences, but obviously in much more of a support role because it's still the Tom Cruise show. It very much seems to just be a continuation of everything we saw in Fallout in terms of the set pieces becoming more elaborate. The build-ups they've become even longer here. So basically, imagine if you took what we saw in Fallout and you just stretched everything out. That's the feeling you get. And even though this is only 20 or so minutes longer than Fallout, it feels quite long, and it basically just sort of lulls you into a sense of going along with it, and then before you know it, it's suddenly over, and you're kind of left scratching your head a little bit and going, well, is that really it? And while I give them all the credit in the world for all the practical effects work they're doing, and of course the intensive stunt work and the crazy over-the-top stunts that they're doing that are selling these films, I've always felt and I've always said that Tom Cruise can try to kill himself any number of ways, but if there's no story there, if there's nothing to really get you invested, you're just reacting to Tom Cruise seeming like he's trying to kill himself. It's more of a reactionary thing. And it was interesting to note that in this film, one of the big moments there's not really a payoff to it because we don't actually see it get completed. There's essentially a cutaway and then it picks up later, and honestly that's done more for surprise and comedy effect. So that was a bit perplexing, if I must say. But for me, the single highlight of the series still remains the Langley break-in in the first film, because that had an entire film focused around it. And when the sound drops out in the vault in that sequence, everybody in the audience catches their breath or grips their armrest, because they're fully invested in the story in that particular moment. Not necessarily, it's not the biggest set piece in the world. It's not a death-defying stunt, but it's the boldness and the audacity of the characters in that moment that invest you in that. And the entire film supports that, right down to the actual sound design dropping out completely at that point when Ethan Hunt almost smacks into the floor. So yes, the action is even bigger than Fallout. The film is even bigger overall, but it's really too big. It's too long, and it doesn't have enough story to support that length, I don't think. However, there is one fantastic bright spot, and this was the number one factor for drawing me in and getting me all excited. And that, again, goes back to what I said before about how there are some definite nods to the first film, because finally, they have brought back Henry Czerny as Kittredge from the first film, who became the sort of antagonist to the Ethan Hunt character, but who was revealed to be the pure company man at his core. The interactions between Czerny and Tom Cruise in the first film are some of the highlights, and we do thankfully get one of those here, right around the opening credits that come in like 15 or 20 minutes into the movie. And for me, the single highlight of this entire experience is every time Henry Czerny is on screen, that just cements the importance of those moments, and he acts up a storm, and his presence has been sorely lacking in all of the other sequels. And my thing has always been, if I ever got a shot at making a Mission Impossible film, my first thing to do would be to bring back the Kittredge character, because you just need that sort of that rivalry, that the antagonism inherent in how he deals with Ethan Hunt. You need that to balance the Cruise characterization, and I feel all the other films have. I mean, they've tried different IMF heads with a bunch of different actors and things, but nothing's ever had the same impact. And that's another reason why I adore the first film so much, and I've never felt any of the sequels stacked up, is there wasn't anybody on the inside of the IMF to really be able to go head to head with Tom Cruise and be able to hold the screen and also oppose him in that way. And the best scene in the movie for me is their confrontation, and they do throw in some tilted angles to sort of suggest the aquarium restaurant scene in Mission Impossible 1 with Brian De Palma going to the wonderful usage of Dutch tilt angles. So you will see a handful of angles like that thrown in, and it seems to be trying to suggest the first film. But for me, the entire film is improved immeasurably by just bringing Kittredge back. So that was the single best element for me. The action and stunts are, as always, are impressive when they're not lifting directly from Bond films. But once again, as within Fallout and all of the last couple of these, when the CGI does come in, it's usually done to accentuate and enhance those sequences, and for me that just takes me out of them. There are a couple moments here where it does really stick out, and it does start to add a bit of a video game flavor to some of the action, unfortunately. Also, the action sequences, again, they go on so long that you just kind of just going along for the ride, and if you start to question stuff, then you're going to start poking holes in the plot, and then the film starts piling up events in these action set pieces, which just creates a sensation of continually building to something. What it is, we don't know, but it's building to something, and really all it does is just extend said action set piece to, probably 30 minutes or more for the biggest ones. I wish there was more of actual plot development, and I wish there was more material to justify the longer runtime. So for me, this unfortunately feels like it's just been filled with quite a bit of hot air to build into the next film, which we'll get in about a year from now. And unfortunately, I think most, if not all, films suffer from this desire to spread stories out or make films back to back or in successive order. It's never as successful as focusing on a single film at a time and perhaps leaving some breadcrumbs, which is sort of how we got into Fallout, because Fallout does have some direct ties to Rogue Nation, and we essentially have a sort of splinter group of the Syndicate from Rogue Nation as the villain in Fallout. So I think that's a much better way to tackle these sort of things. It's fine if you want to spread out a story over two films, but I think it's much better if you have a legitimate long enough story with enough satisfying sections or acts to it that would justify having more than one film, and I don't think you get that here. But it's hard to tell because we haven't got the whole story yet, so we will have to wait another year to get the sort of, really to get the final act of what we get here in part one. So unfortunately, I felt this was it's kind of a frustrating experience. Also, with the bits of the submarine opening and the definite echoes of the MacGuffin plot of the ATAC and For Your Eyes Only. Although with none of that film's focus on its plot or the chase of different forces to recover the ATAC first, that means the film definitely meanders around, and it meanders for far too long. There's also a sense, and this is me just with I read too many film trades hat on, but with the submarine and how the film ends, and we know in the second film they're going to continue this story, and the fact that Christopher McQuarrie was tied for a long time, and I guess still is tied to the Ice Station Zebra remake that Warner Brothers has been wanting to do, and I really hope they don't do it. Kind of makes you wonder, are they going to go Ice Station Zebra in the second film? Because there's definitely enough sort of echoes of that, and the fact that it's under ice, and that's what my brain started thinking about. And again, that's the project that Christopher McQuarrie's been attached to, I think, since like 2013 or so. So that's been going along for quite some time, and maybe they just accumulated a lot of research and just decided to use it in the MI series. I don't know, but that's just an amusing thought for fellow spy nerds out there who have brushed up on their Alistair McLean. Ultimately, I don't think Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, which is the full title, is as good as the film that immediately preceded it, Mission Impossible Fallout, which I didn't think was as good as Rogue Nation, which preceded it, which I didn't think was quite as polished as Ghost Protocol, and I don't think any of the films even match the first film, which is the only one I truly adore. I've enjoyed various things in all the sequels, but I've never been invested in them in a story sense, and to this day I continue to be with the first film when I rewatch it, because it does get you invested in the lead characters and the specific situations. Plus it has a sense of fun to it, which this film in particular, Dead Reckoning Part 1, yeah, they throw in some jokes here and there, but it's not a fun film. It's even less fun than Fallout was, and Fallout wasn't really what you would call a fun film. Now, I did see this in a Dolby Cinema location, which of course means dual 4K projection, Dolby Vision HDR, and Dolby Atmos for the sound system. I do think this film benefits immensely from that. You will want to probably try and see this in a premium engagement if possible, in terms of a more premium hall. They did, I believe, design at least some of the sequences were, I guess technically optimized more for IMAX, but they were not obviously shot with the IMAX film dimensions in mind, nor was it something like Ghost Protocol with how that film designed the specific sequences to be really expanded upon in the IMAX format. So I do think Dolby Cinema is probably the best option overall, because you do also get Dolby Vision HDR, which is very important, dual 4K projection, which is enormously important for better visual clarity, but then also Dolby Atmos. I don't think this film has a stupendous sound mix that's going to make you really sit up and take notice, but it does sound very good in Atmos, and I've enjoyed all the sound presentations of this series, so I think going for the premium engagement for this 7th installment is the way to go. Plus, at most theaters, it's not terribly much more than a standard ticket, especially if you're going at night, for going to a Dolby Hall and getting those improvements. And because they did, shoot this relatively well, it is obviously many notches above your standard fare of today. So I think this would be one of the films you could justify spending a little bit extra and seeing it in a Dolby Hall and getting the better picture, the better HDR grading, and of course the better sound with Atmos. I still think the first film has the best sound mix, because it's one of my favorite sound mixes of all time. I think the first film still has not yet been equaled or beaten by any of the series, but the series has gone in a completely different direction. So the first couple of films really are still kind of outliers, and with Ghost Protocol onward, that film sort of did a mini reboot. And they're also, and not to get into spoilers, but they do try something different with this film, because they are, with the character of Ethan Hunt, there are a couple little flashes and a couple little mentions of a history and backstory we've not seen before. So they are trying a little bit of retconning with Ethan Hunt's backstory, and so I guess in part 2 we're going to get more of that, because they don't really do anything with it here. I don't think that's really a spoiler, but it's just a particular note of interest, I think, because they've not really done something like that before, and I think this runs a little bit contrary to some of the basic material we've been given before, or what's been mentioned in press releases, or just things that fans have been able to suss out reading through the subtext of all the films. So that was also interesting to see. So to summarize all of that, which is my usual style of immediate reaction review, where I sort of do a loose discussion of these things as they occur to me, because I only saw the film just a few hours ago. And it is a lot to process because it is simply so long. It takes a while to think about it afterwards and even remember elements of the plot. I guess the ultimate question is, do you get your money's worth for a ticket? And I think the answer to that is yes. You will be entertained in moments. Yes, there is spectacle and there is more practical effects work and practical stuntmanship than you're going to see in anything else. This is the closest you're going to get to an actual, real, proper, authentic James Bond film experience, because Eon seems to be content to let Tom Cruise do that in the Mission Impossible films instead of doing it themselves. So this is the most action and adventure you're going to get out of a modern film experience. And you also have to take that into consideration. So we do have to kind of take what we can get. But it's going to, I think, hit different audience members a certain way. If you're really heavily invested into the Mission Impossible films and the franchise and where it's gone, you'll probably be completely entertained. But if you liked certain films in the series more than others, or longer, more bloated films kind of bother you, you're definitely going to notice that here. I think all the performances are solid. I think the presence of the new villain is quite excellent, but we don't get to find out too much about him, so I guess that also will come up in the second film, along with more about and probably hopefully some actual interaction with the sentient entity AI, which we don't really get here. Unfortunately, I think the side characters and other members of the IMF team are the ones who get short-sighted the most in terms of screen time and things to actually do. As usual, we get some new faces in the government offices, but they just kind of come and go very quickly, as has happened in the past couple of MI films as well. I do regret the intrusion of CGI into the action sequences, which does really take me out of them, and some of the action sequences work pretty well, and they work best when we're able to actually relate with the actual characters involved, and everything seems really grounded. But there are moments where, again, it does unfortunately start to resemble a bit more of a video game cutscene, and with what you see in the trailers of the train sequence with Ethan Hunt jumping around, and almost makes you think of at least it makes me think of a little bit of how a lot of people are still chasing the train opening of Uncharted 2 and the train level. So it's like Ethan Hunt is trying to emulate Nathan Drake there. So it basically, I don't think it's as strong as Fallout. And I think it basically, it's like if you took Fallout and you put a lot of hot air to expand it and then split off the main chunk for a second film. So I think you'll be able to evaluate this film much better when we have the rest of the story in part 2, which we're supposed to get next year. As it is right now, it's just, it leaves you with a sort of, at least I came away with a definite feeling of not being quite satisfied, and just it kind of has the feeling of filler in that sense, and that was definitely disappointing. So I do think it is a weaker film than what we saw in Fallout, but I don't think we can fully evaluate Dead Reckoning Part 1 until we get Dead Reckoning Part 2 and we see what the whole overarching story is like. And it might be one of those experiences that it really works best when you have both parts and you can watch them together and just watch a really long film. So Unfortunately, I don't think it's the. I don't think I saw the same film that all the other critics are raving about. But if you love the first film, you do get to see Kittredge come back, and that for me was the highlight of the whole film. And the handful of scenes he has, I did feel my ticket was earned in terms of my ticket money. And as soon as he popped up in the trailer, I was like, okay, yes, I was gonna go already, but that's the must for me, is that they finally brought Kittredge back. So if you're like me and you've been waiting for that ever since the first film, well, you're gonna at least get some fun with those sequences where especially when he and Ethan Hunt basically have another sit down, and there are some nice pyrotechnics. So those are my overall thoughts on seeing Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 in a Dolby Cinema earlier today. I encourage people to go check it out. It is you're still going to get your money's worth, but if you're a devoted fan of this series, or you're a James Bond fan, or you're a fan of action adventure or spy thrillers in general, I think that causes you to have a more nuanced and detailed look at these things. And if you're like me, you analyze films to death because that's just how you're wired. So anytime I see a new film, and particularly a series entry and a spy film in particular, then I'm in full analysis mode. I'd be very curious to hear what your thoughts may be. I know I'm probably an outlier on this, but I do feel that it's not as strong as some of the films that led up to it. And I do think with the Mission Impossible series that the law of diminishing returns unfortunately does apply. And I myself really want to see them return to the dedicated, grounded spycraft and tone of the first film, and that's what I've been hoping for ever since 1996, when I was so blown away by the energy and the tone of the first film, blending a spy thriller with a summer popcorn film and really making it a fun experience. You get that in sparks and in some of the later films, but I just feel none of these really ever fully invest you. And so it becomes more about the spectacle and the bigness. And this is the biggest one and has the most spectacle to date. But I don't think it has the gravitas it seems to think that it does. And I think that's his biggest problem. So we'll really have to reconvene next year and see what part 2 brings us, to then better be able to evaluate Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. So as always, these are just my own initial thoughts, and I would love to hear yours in the comments below to keep the discussion going. Do check out Dead Reckoning Part 1 if you're at all interested. You will get your money's worth from the theatrical experience, and I would recommend seeing it in a Dolby Cinema if you have one near you. So as always, I hope you've enjoyed my babblings about films and film culture and new releases as well. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.
Good morning, Mr. Crusader. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to review the entire video history of the first Mission Impossible film. This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck, Crusader.
I quite liked this tape, you know. Well, I guess I will choose the Cinema of the Caribbean.